So welcome everybody. Welcome back to the Cutting Edge lecture series in the International Development Department. I think you all know me by now, but I'm the convener of this year's seminar series. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping. This is going to be recorded and it's going to be available on YouTube as well as as a podcast. I ask all of you to turn off your mobile phones or to silence them. And third of all, again, if there is a fire, we are supposed to sort of assemble outside the Source We Hock building, and we'll guide you there. So in this afternoon's session, we're going to be reflecting on the crisis of peacekeeping, which is unfortunately a very relevant topic in the world today, and it's something that came out of last week's session as well. We have a couple of fabulous speakers to help us reflect on this. First of all, we have Marsha Henry, who is now at Queen's University Belfast in the Mitchell Institute, where she is the Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton Chair in Women, Peace, Security and Justice. But until January, she was actually at LSE in the Gender Department and as Associate Professor. Her research broadly is covering gender, peace and security, and she's done a lot of ethnographic fieldwork on peacekeeping and militarization development. She's published extensively in journals like Security Dialogue, Security and Development, Globalizations, Conflict, and she has a new book that's just out this April called The End of Peacekeeping, Gender, Race, and the Martial Politics of Intervention. So today is very much a cutting-edge lecture. We're also very excited and delighted to have our own colleague, Dr. Myfanwy James, who is going to be our discussant this evening. She also works on the politics of humanitarian intervention, focusing in the Eastern DRC. Like Marsha, she does ethnographic research, particularly looking at the way that humanitarian groups negotiate access with armed groups, as well as looking at the inequality among humanitarian workers between foreign and domestic staff, so looking at kind of broader structural inequality within the aid industry. So we're first going to let Marsha speak for 30 to 45 minutes, and then we are going to give Myfanwy and Marsha a chance to talk for about 30 minutes, and we're going to hopefully open up for questions between 5 and 5:15, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. And again, we have microphones on both levels, thanks to Asta upstairs. So please ask lots of questions, ask them thoughtful questions, challenging questions. They're ready for all of your questions. So without further ado, can we please welcome Marsha back to the LSE.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thanks, Myfanwy, for inviting me back. It's so nice to be back. I think the last time I did something with international development was almost like 15 years ago, which I think dates me more than it dates the department. And we did, I remember we had this kind of like gender and ID sort of collaborative workshop on methods and fieldwork. It was really, really fascinating. And actually some of those issues that came out way back then, I think are still relevant to the project, and you might see traces of them in the book. Should you buy the book, I won't sell it to you. In fact, I'll recommend that you access the chapters that are available from the library if you are piqued after this, this session. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me, and I think I'm so happy to be in dialogue with students both in development studies or within international development and beyond, because I think it's one of the audiences actually that I've had the least kind of debate and conversation with. In fact, you'll be surprised and probably a little bored to hear that peacekeeping studies or peacekeeping scholarship is a fairly niche, smallish, well, not a smallish group of scholars, but a relatively traditional sort of subfield of peace studies, of conflict studies, of security studies, military, and so on studies. And I feel like some of the dialogue that I've been having and that I have in the book with peacekeeping scholarship would probably benefit from a wider engagement, and perhaps I wouldn't have so much of a grudge match that the book is really about. It's a kind of kvetch in a way of all the problems that I have with all the peacekeeping scholarships. So yeah, so maybe you'll say, yes, Marsha, everything you say is right in that book, and peacekeeping scholars have it wrong for the most part. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of a background on the book and sort of the basic premises of the book, and hopefully this will provide you with enough of a sort of introduction that you can access some of the arguments that I'm trying to make. So I outline in the book a little bit how it was a little bit of an accidental way in which I came to study peacekeeping. It's not something that one normally accidentally comes to study. I think development studies would be something much more sort of natural that one would come to. But actually I came from development studies. I was doing my PhD work on gender and development, and basically I was interested in the sort of critical approaches and how I could bring those critical approaches to a study of nothing to do with peacekeeping. My PhD work was really looking at representations of women's reproductive decision-making in India, and how it had been represented in the diaspora, in the UK and in Canada, as well as how it had been represented in Indian newspapers, mainstream newspapers. So I've always been concerned with these kind of global north narratives about the global south and about development and humanitarian contexts. And then so when I started my first full-time academic job at Bristol, a colleague came up to me and said, hey, you do stuff on gender and development. I've been doing stuff on gender in the military. Are you interested in kind of like combining forces, so to speak, and doing this project on sexual exploitation and abuse in peacekeeping missions or in humanitarian settings? And I was like, oh, okay, I can bring my stuff on representations, my stuff on gender and women's agency to this kind of study. So I began to immerse myself in this whole new set of literatures, coming with my development studies, my gender development studies baggage, and I came across a very diverse set of literatures. This was like the early 2000s literature. And I basically came across a sort of majority, and you'll recognize this from development studies and humanitarian and disaster studies more broadly. But there were two sort of main approaches. There was the problem-solving approach. So that was really about like, here are problems that peacekeeping can respond to, or here are problems with peacekeeping that we need to fix. And then there was the more critical approaches, drawing on what we used to say all the time was postmodern study, postmodern theory. Nobody says that anymore, I don't think. Post-structuralist, sort of critical theories, a whole set of critical theories, to look at, what is the foundational thinking in peacekeeping from the start, like how do we imagine spaces that need to be kept peacefully. And so I was very struck by this critical body of literature, and it was made up of these sort of three critical fields. It was made up of mostly feminist work that was, critiquing the patriarchal nature of these global north processes and responses. It was post-colonial or critical race work that was, looking at the colonial framings, the colonial lens through which a lot of these peacekeeping missions were established and carried out. And then there was the anti-militarist literature, which was also feminist and post-colonial in many regards. It was much more a sort of peace-oriented literature that was critiquing the very martial aspects of peacekeeping. So I came at it from this interdisciplinary perspective, and I sort of navigated my way into the literature through this very critical approach. A very different way in which to enter this field, I would say most of my peers in peacekeeping scholarship have entered the field through a very different trajectory. Not so many through development studies, not so many through interdisciplinary, or even through political geography, for example. Most have come at it through security studies, through international relations, I would say mainstream elements of those, or some have come at it from peace and conflict studies, but have tended to approach it again from this problem-solving perspective. So, but really strangely, in the 2000s, there was a whole set of texts that I found incredibly persuasive, politically persuasive, that were characterized by this feminist, post-colonial, and critical race and anti-militarist approaches. And this set of literature, it's really around 5 or 6 key texts in the early 2000s. Those are, I think, rarely acknowledged and incorporated into the scholarship that that proceeds after that period. So from about the early 2000s to around 2008, 2009, maybe even 2010. Then after that, it really like tailors off in terms of those critical perspectives. So actually, this this trajectory got me thinking. So I worked on a project at Bristol, as I mentioned, with another colleague, and what we did was we got this funding to look at sexual exploitation and abuse, and when we arrived in the first peacekeeping mission that we visited, which was Cyprus, I've just recently returned to Cyprus after 20 years. It was really fascinating to kind of look at both the changes in the landscape. We were really struck by the physical landscape, and then what we ended up calling the socio-spatial power relations that we could see manifested. So we were really struck by just the stark contrast of what happens when a peacekeeping mission is established. It completely changes the landscape, it completely changes how you navigate those spaces from when you get off the plane as a researcher, as a peacekeeper, when you, depending on whether you have the equivalent of a diplomatic or UN blue passport, to where you live, where you stay, the hotels you go to, the bars, cafes, everything. And so we were really struck by that very stark. So what we did in that project was to look at how peacekeeping basically has this socio-spatial impact on places. Just a quick example to give you a sense of it. So Pristina, which is a really relatively small city, can you imagine like 15,000 troops, 15,000 militarized peacekeepers arriving into this small city, and then it's just an overwhelming presence of military personnel in a city that has experienced a very particular form of conflict. And so, yeah, that has, and then you think about, just add on to that the majority of the military personnel are men. So this is a very patriarchal, a very masculine kind of socio-spatial sort of set of relations. So we wrote this book called Insecure Spaces, which is really about how peacekeeping changes how it impacts whether people feel secure or insecure in those contexts. And that was really about whether peacekeepers feel more secure or insecure, as well as what I term in this book, the peace kept, which sounds like a very objectifying term, but I use it as a way of politicizing the sort of pacification of what are called beneficiaries of peacekeeping, to just really draw attention to the ways in which they are denied a certain agency. So then what I wanted to do in this book, so I was really struck, that was almost 20 years ago that I did that original field work in a couple of peacekeeping missions, and where we documented these socio-spatial changes. But I was really struck by how I felt like I was arguing in a field, in a literature, something very different than most people. And so I just came across book after book that was all about fixing peacekeeping and making it better, reforming it. There's all kinds of projects. You can look at this literature if you want. There's so many books, there's so many articles, which is like, if we just tweak this, if we just do this, if we just more female peacekeepers, if we, the more recent stuff has been, which has been argued by both scholars and military strategists, which is like, we need to actually get more martial, we need to get more military. That will make peacekeeping more effective. And you might ask, how do you measure that effectivity? But so I was really struck by, okay, so I've come into this from this particular sort of background, and what I found in my own field work over the years is that I wanted to really convey in my book that if we go back to these critical theorists and these critical books that I said were more or less a handful in the early 2000s, maybe we might come to a different set of conclusions about what we want to do with peacekeeping. So I started to think of peacekeeping not just as a socio-spatial project, but as an epistemic project. So how do we come to know, how do you come to know? I'm so glad you're coming to know it through my critical lens, because it's only like the first few weeks, so hopefully you haven't read any of that other stuff. No, I'm teasing. How do we come to know peacekeeping, right? Like how do you come to know development? How do we come to know humanitarian responses? How do we come to know any kind of like intervention that is organized and imagined by the global north, by global governance institutions, right? So I started to think, well, knowledge is produced by, for, and through people, sites, and discourses in peacekeeping. So peacekeepers and the peace kept, but also these global governance institutions like the UN, they produce a certain kind of knowledge by establishing a peacekeeping mission. So a very complex set of constructions take place. And so I wanted to carry through this idea of peacekeeping as an epistemic project and think about drawing on those critical ideas that I got from those 2000s texts. So one of them was a text that, this text I would definitely recommend you read. So this is a book by Shireen Razak called Dark Threats, White Knights. And it follows, I mean, you should read everything by Razak. It's completely relevant to any kind of critical work you want to do in development studies or beyond. She draws primarily on post-colonial and critical race theories, even though she also writes a lot on gender and is located in gender studies. She's often labeled as a post-colonial or critical race scholar, which I think is also interesting about how we categorize these different critical fields. But she wrote this book, and this book is about what she articulates as a form of colonial violence that is enacted by Canadian peacekeepers in Somalia. So she takes this one case of peacekeeping violence committed by a particular regiment against a Somali teenager. And the book catalogs this incident of violence and how the Canadian military and Canadian peacekeepers and the Canadian public responded to this murder, and how it was essentially, what she suggests is how it was washed away by these national myths of Canadians being, I'm a Canadian, so I think I can say this. And I always recommend her book because it kind of like helps people to like not want to go to Canada for tourism and stuff like that. And I feel like I'm doing a good job of discouraging you all from seeing this very artificial beauty in a place with so many ghosts, literal and figuratively. So she talks about this whitewashing that happens, and Canadians are the good guys, and so they couldn't possibly be involved in this, deeply involved, because essentially at their core, and she uses this wonderful metaphor a deeply problematic but also very compelling metaphor. She talks about the clean snows of Petawawa, which is a place where the Canadian military has a base, and she talks about how the peacekeepers involved talked very much about how they missed the clean snows. Again, you can't get any more colonial than this. You can't get any more white supremacist than this. The clean snows of Petawawa, they missed those, and they tried to imagine this clean white blanket landscape because the heat and the dust sort of made them go crazy. She very much refers to then, you know, of course, these Heart of Darkness kind of mythologies. And you see this very much actually connected with histories of peacekeeping in DRC and Democratic Republic of Congo. So yeah. So, and then what she does is she uses this one main sort of theoretical frame, which is the global color line. And I found the use of the global color line, you know, Du Bois' concept, she uses it to think about peacekeeping as establishing a global color line, as a civilizing mission, that it basically separates the civilized from the non-civilized and so on, and that this color line is used to justify these forms of violence. So in the end of her book, you know, she reaches she hints at the end of peacekeeping, but doesn't go that far, and sort of suggests that basically it's up to, you know, others to decide what should replace it or what should happen. That she's, you know, in a sense involved in this critical project of exposing the colonial violence underneath. So I think this color line works very well for thinking about a lot of different things that take place in peacekeeping. And so I used it to think about many different aspects, but in particular, some of the Global South peacekeepers that I spoke to in my fieldwork, and the kind of political economy of the work that these Global South peacekeepers are involved in. So I spent time with a contingent, or it's not really a contingent, but it's a group of female peacekeepers from the Indian Militarized Police Wing. And again, it was really fascinating listening to their own narratives about what they thought they would get out of peacekeeping, how they represented themselves. Yeah, just the ways in which they felt they were making a contribution, or they were plagued by their own, as they termed it, their own homesickness. I found it really fascinating that the more recent research on peacekeeping actually highlights dangers to peacekeepers as justification for increased military, an increased militarization of peacekeeping. So, you know, peacekeeping scholars like Paul Williams, for example, but also Roland Paris and others have sort of suggested that the more robust peacekeeping is, robust, keep that in mind, as a term you'll see a lot in the peacekeeping literature, that the more robust, the more Global South peacekeepers can be protected and lives saved. So, you know, just to go back, one last point about the global color line, and then we can come back to it a bit more in the discussion, hopefully. But there's a book called Saving Lives by Holtman, and this is about peacekeeping, you know, the need for peacekeeping. It's a quantitative study, very compelling, amazing data compiled. Comes out of Uppsala and this big, large data set that they have about peacekeeping. And the indications that are derived from this huge data set show across all peacekeeping missions that essentially they are more positive than they are negative, that they result in saving lives. And it's really interesting because in this book, one of the chapters is titled something like Darkest Heart of Africa, or Darkest, you know, and I thought that was really fascinating, that in this book that says peacekeeping saves lives, you know, that argues for maintaining peacekeeping from an evidence-based perspective, that they have this kind of like this colonial, not like, this colonial metaphor, yeah. So, yeah, just to say how I use that global color line. And then really then I look at the ways in which, for example, gender is used in, so early peacekeeping scholars were feminist scholars like Cynthia Coburn, Cynthia Enloe, Diane Mazurana, Angela Raven Roberts. There's a couple of really great edited books. Again, probably because most students tend to be assigned articles. You don't tend to get a lot of edited collections. That was really the 2000s, where there were many edited collections that I think would have been really provide you with some of those critical insights. So in those, they argued that peacekeeping was, essentially a very patriarchal practice. Not only was it dominated by military men, but it was, it had a very masculinist approach. So again, they very much echoing those debates on gender and development, gender in development, women in development, and beyond. The instrumentalization of women, female peacekeepers has been used. You can just go onto the UN website and you can, look at videos or look at Twitter feeds just to see the ways in which women peacekeepers are talked about in a way in very passé terms. Like they're seen to have these strategic capabilities, and even though the research in military sociology, for example, and in wider organizational studies more broadly, demonstrate that there really is no basis for believing that along lines of gender or along race or ethnicity, if you were able to use those factors in any sort of sustainable way, in any ethical way, that they don't actually make a difference to effectiveness at all. In fact, it's a much wider range of issues. So I was really fascinated by all this UN literature, which was like, if we just get more female peacekeepers in, everything will be okay. I mean, the UN never actually went any further to actually check if that was true, because when they had the all-female squad that I visited and spent time with, I mean, most of the women would tell you that they were like extremely isolated as a squad. So it's quite hard to isolate 120 women in a way in a mission, but it meant that they couldn't travel freely, or they couldn't do things that other peacekeepers were able to do, like military officers were able to do. They couldn't drive vehicles on their own. They were always hanging around in a large group. And so that meant that the kind of impacts that they could have, first of all, the foundational aspect of women military personnel altering the landscape is already problematic, and maybe we'll discuss that. But then to also physically restrict movement. And I remember visiting India House, and the woman commander told me, she was giving me the background on the squad and the work they were doing, and then she was telling me, don't worry, 118 of this 120 squad, they're all married and have children. I don't know why she thought I was worried about that, but interesting in and of itself. And she said, but two are engaged. So it's okay. And so there's a real panic. She never told me anything about the marital status of the other all-male squad, and she never called it an all-male squad. The all-male squad was considerably younger than this all-female squad and all-women squad, and so I was really, really fascinated. So I argue in the book that actually, like Aaron Belkin argues in his book, Bring Me Men, that actually using gender in this way, or the sort of deployment of a sort of liberal politics of gender equality and incorporating female peacekeepers, is actually a foil for empire. Really, it's a kind of mass distraction from the kinds of activities that peacekeepers are involved in. And so, yeah, and I think if you look at the stuff on sexual exploitation and abuse, which in both projects I barely get to, so that tells you a little bit about how distracting these peacekeeping environments are from focusing on certain kinds of research questions. But yeah, I was really fascinated by the models of gender that were used by the UN. I mean, you'll not be surprised that they were pretty simplistic models. They were very binary models. So, you know, they would sort of say like, oh, okay, if we have more women in this particular setting, then local women will be more likely to, you know, identify and, you know, give them intelligence or whatever, you know, whatever there were the assumptions. And actually talking with female peacekeepers was really fascinating because they actually wanted to establish their distinctiveness from local people all the time. In fact, they wanted to show how sort of, in a way, morally superior they were, and how they were good women, and the women that were the peace kept were perhaps in need of some sort of rescuing and saving. So even, you know, women, because I remember asking women peacekeepers, what do you share in common? And literally it was kind of like, you know, tropical environment and food, you know, and freshly available fruit. They couldn't you know, and the Uruguayan women peacekeepers that I spoke with and spent time with, they said, oh, actually, these women that we see ourselves in them, but 20 years ago. So there was this kind of like very developmental, linear kind of model of where they had come from. So yeah, and then, you know, before sort of moving towards the end of the book, I talk about the martial politics of peacekeeping, which is that's kind of like the root cause of peacekeeping's not untied, not detached from what I've already said about its colonial roots and its patriarchal roots. But of course, like, you know, and I talk about this in the book, just the rhythm of peacekeeping, the spaces are really dominated by military time, by military space. You know, I think in the opening of the book, I talk about, you know, how peacekeeping as an epistemic project is very much linked with this military time. So, you know, just as a kind of like a sort of slightly humorous anecdote, so on one of the field trips, so one of my colleagues went to Liberia first in 2005 and did some of the research, and then myself and another colleague went in 2006, and he had sort of set up everything with us and the fixer and, you know, our sort of support there. And so we kind of, again, problematically imagined ourselves in a white SUV akin to the UN. We thought we'd be in this kind of like, you know, humanitarian sort of vehicle. And when Paul, our driver, came to pick us up, he came in what was actually 2 cars molded into one. And so the back of the car was like an old taxi, so it was yellow, the 3/4 of the car, and the front was, you know, another taxi with only partial yellow. And so when we were doing field work, every time we would stop and pull over at the side of the road to take pictures of billboards and different things, people would try and get in the vehicle. And then the driver would get really cross. He'd be like, get out of the car, you know, this isn't a taxi. And they were like, sorry, we thought it was a taxi, you know, kind of thing. And then they would get out. So and literally you would lift up the mats and there was like these holes. We could see the ground as anyway, we had problematically imagined ourselves in some sort of like, you know, UN mimicry mirror, and actually we were in this kind of like problematic vehicle which could only go so fast. But Paul took us on one of the days to a couple of meetings, and then we'd finished early the meetings, and he said, oh, I'll take you so you can see another part of the city that you haven't seen already, that I haven't taken you to. And he started driving. And when he came up to this old abandoned hotel, which he'd obviously brought other people to prior, you know, during the conflict and prior to the conflict, he suddenly came up to what was a Swedish manned base. They'd set up in this old hotel. Actually, UN missions often take over old hotels, and it's a really interesting thing if you're thinking about, you know, how they occupy those spaces. And so he got into a bit of a confrontation with the Swedish peacekeeper who was, you know, at this gate, and He was like, I always go through here. This is always the route that I take. And the Swedish peacekeeper was like, well, you're not going through here. And again, that had really struck us about how spaces change and how people's knowledge about their own communities and the history of conflict within them is denied to them, so that they can no longer access those spaces, and it becomes this UN space. So I was really struck by the ways in which the martial politics of peacekeeping, lacks the ability to see that someone else existed in this space and navigated this space very differently. And again, these peacekeepers were not trained to really deal with this type of conflict. In fact, I don't know that they're trained to deal with any kind of conflict, but that incident really struck me. And then, again, if there's more time in the question and answer period, I'll talk about other ways in which I can give you a couple of examples of peacekeepers' kind of love-hate relationship with the martial institutions that they came from. Yeah, and then I guess towards the end of the book, what I really want to do is try and sort of decolonize, degender, and demilitarize peacekeeping by focusing on the peace kept. And I'll just tell you that that's a really small part of the book, although I claim it to be a really big part in the beginning, because I say that most of the peacekeeping scholarship that's not very critical, that's problem solving, that doesn't mean it's not critical, it's just different critical. Most of that literature isn't really interested in the peace kept. In fact, peacekeepers are foregrounded in that. It's all about, like, how do we save peacekeeping property? How do we save peacekeepers? Although they're not really committed to that, because the majority of peacekeepers deployed to the most dangerous areas are actually militaries with the least economic resources, actually. So if you think about Chadian peacekeepers from Chad being deployed in Western Sahara or in Mali or in Central African Republic, some of those peacekeepers, and Razik talks about in her book peacekeepers who were deployed in Somalia without shoes, without military fatigues even, so. Just think about the kind of inequalities within peacekeeping. Yeah, so I want to look at, what does it mean to focus on the peace kept? But again, you might find that that's the point at which you want to criticize the book, because I don't think I focus, I get so sort of caught up in critiquing peacekeeping that I myself don't do that. And I guess towards the end of the book, I start to make the argument for abolishing peacekeeping, for the end of peacekeeping, because I guess I was really influenced by the, I was really influenced by reading critical race studies literature, which was talking about defunding the police and subsequently defunding the military. I was influenced by sort of some of the work that Kimberly Crenshaw was doing in relation to intersectionality, and looking at how women in the US, black women killed by the police or injured by the police in the US, have been left out of so many of the Black Lives Matters narratives or public campaigns. And so she created this Say Her Name campaign. And I thought, oh, that's actually an inspiration for thinking about, if, as Angela Davis talks about prisons, if she talks about how they're so taken for granted that we can't actually imagine life without them, how could I apply that kind of thinking to peacekeeping? Like, is it, what are the attachments that we have to peacekeeping that we just can't imagine it ending? Maybe you all don't think that. Maybe you think you're quite fine with it ending. But I guess I've been struggling with it for 20 years, reading this critical literature and, struggling to articulate how. So essentially what I do argue is that because we can't escape the colonial, the patriarchal, and the militaristic roots of peacekeeping, because we can never step outside of those, then the only alternative really is to think about the end of peacekeeping. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
There's... So for the next sort of 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to pick up on a few things you said and also kind of relate some of the key points in this book to some recent fieldwork that I've done in Eastern DRC. Yeah. I suppose I am going to pick you up later on about the last chapter of your book, which is related to this title, saying, hang on a minute, if we move past, or we really try to move past conversations about tweaking, about reforming what is currently there, how do we imagine something beyond peacekeeping? What does the end of peacekeeping look like? And I think that's what makes this book so timely, because I spent the summer in Eastern DRC, which is where I've studied kind of protracted international intervention. And the kind of questions I was interested in asking this time were all about withdrawal. The UN peacekeeping in Eastern DRC has been there for the best part of 30 years, and it's now in the process of withdrawing. Over the summer, it left Bukavu, so South Kivu, one province where it's been for a very long time, and it's meant to be leaving North Kivu. And the big debate in Goma, which is the city where this peacekeeping mission is based, is first of all, should they leave? Should they not leave? If they do leave, why are they leaving? And also, crucially, what comes afterwards? So I think this book speaks to lots of those themes. I think one thing that particularly appeals in this book is the argument that there isn't a tweak out of some of the deeper critiques of peacekeeping. And I think that what you say there about the problem of peacekeeping being so taken for granted that we can't think past it is exactly what some of the Congolese activists were telling me over the summer, that we actually find it hard to imagine an alternative because we've grown up with peacekeeping, but all we know is that what it offers, even on the tin, even the best case scenario, is not enough for the kind of political future that we're trying to imagine for ourselves. So I think this is a really, really interesting book for starting that conversation about what does it look like if we move beyond conversations about reform. So the first question I wanted to ask you then was about this shift that you make, that you, I think you called it a grudge match, that you do take on quite a lot of the established peacekeeping literature from the last sort of 20 years, and you have this literature review, which I found fascinating, because when I picked up the book, I thought I knew what was going to be in the literature review. And instead, as you said, you picked these 5 to 6 texts, which I admit, some of them I'd never heard of. And they are making the same kind of arguments which new literature today is making, the same kind of critiques. And it made me realize that development studies, humanitarian studies, peacekeeping studies, these all operate in silos. And what we're seeing is the same kind of cyclical debates about inherent paternalism, power dynamics, historical complexities, re-articulated in different language, and coming back again and again. But clearly, some of these older debates and really interesting works have been missed out. So could you tell us a little bit more just about this shift and kind of why you decided to take on the kind of established guard of this literature and what you think it does conceptually, because I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, I think the established guard is a good way of putting it. Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's, you know, I guess I'll find out in Chicago in March 2025 when International Studies Association convenes, and I'm going there, how frosty a reception I get from the peacekeeping. I've already gotten a sense of it. I'm generally never invited to participate on the peacekeeping panels. It's only a small group of critical scholars, but I'm sort of welcomed into some other folds, so maybe there's a blessing in that, or there's a silver lining in who you want to be engaging with. But, you know, I think, okay, so again, I thought there was this key report that I write about in the book, 2018, I think, written by a former military commander from a number of peacekeeping missions, peacekeeping scholar, and maybe one other person, maybe a policy person, I can't remember. There's at least 2 authors. And in it, this is the report. Gender is zero mentions of gender, which I find amazing in 2018, talking about peacekeeping and not even a reference. And in it, they argue basically for these, like, they advocate for, you know, addressing conflict and insecurity challenges such as Boko Haram by doing these kind of like targeted missions that require sort of more traditional military activity. And they argue for like investing in, you know, AI and different technologies, but basically buying new helicopters, essentially. But basically these targeted sort of like drop these soldiers in, they'll weed out these terrorists, and that will be peacekeeping. And, you know, and so I found that, I mean, it doesn't quite say it in the report, but it's a kind of like, this is what conflict looks like by these peacekeeping experts, not by conflict experts, which I also find fascinating. So the UN's like really has basically, you know, supported this study, and, you know, the UN's, it gives them a raison d'etre to continue, you know, building up various aspects of the project. So yeah, so I was really fascinated by the fact that is like, that there is some kind of like flailing ends to peacekeeping anyway. And that's what mainstream peacekeeping scholars have been saying to me. Well, you wrote your book End of Peacekeeping, but peacekeeping sort of ended anyway. So, you know, I feel like I'm missing the mark for a second time. But I think the literature, the critical literature, I was surprised that a couple of books on gender, a couple of books on empire, missed out these key critical texts. And so for me, part of the book is also like honoring a citational debt. So some of those books that you might be surprised to find, I think I was surprised that they weren't on these lists over and over again, on these syllabi, in the bibliography. So that's the first thing I do when I get like a book on peacekeeping, is I flip to the back and look at the bibliography. There's like, you know, there's key people that you just don't see over and over again. And they're not only the feminist scholars. So part of what I wanted to do with this was to, you know, just to make visible that trajectory and how important it is for those books to be acknowledged and that work to be acknowledged. And I guess, but I feel that was this grudge match that I talk about. It was partly a personal commitment to doing that, rather than one that I really expected to change the field, because when I published with my co-author in 2009, in fact, one of the, somebody who was working in the UN who'd facilitated a lot of our fieldwork in Haiti said to me, and she had done her PhD on peacekeeping and various sort of humanitarian topics in relation to Ethiopia, and she said to me, you know, oh, I read your book, I didn't find it very good. And I was like, oh, okay, well, what, it's already published, but, you know, well, what didn't you, she said it wasn't very useful. And so I remember when I was writing the proposal for this book, I had this whole paragraph, which was kind of like, you know, this book is not for people working in peacekeeping. And, you know, it was a real sort of angry tirade. And then a couple of my colleagues were like, maybe just take that out. Like, if you know, people in peacekeeping read your book, so great, but don't like purposefully exclude them from buying your book. And I was like, no, but like, I don't want this to be a book that someone's gonna go, okay, so how can we, you know, all they need to do is read the title, and then they'll get what my practical solution is. That
said, right? I think anyone that wants to work in peacekeeping should read this book, because what you do get is a different perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that really struck me when I was reading it was that I think it really helps to understand the kind of anti-peacekeeping protests that we see around the world. Again, to relate it to Eastern DRC, just somewhere where I have the most experience of this, I've kind of got caught up in these protests a couple of times accidentally. And it's a very dangerous place to be somebody that is visibly white foreigner and coded as such, and is in a car. Because all of these things you're saying about the way that peacekeeping alters space, it creates new inequalities, it's actually burning cars often, which is the key thing that happens in these protests. And I think I've always been really shocked in the kind of debates that are taking place in this peacekeeping mission in DRC, because the debate seems to be stuck between how do we improve the mission so that people see the light and they understand that it's doing good work, and then also how do we make sense of the kind of people who are protesting, why are they protesting? And I think what your book does is show that actually there are very legitimate reasons to be protesting emergency peacekeeping operations being a dominant mode of governance for 30 years. And I think one thing that your book does, and I quite like this idea of the peace kept, is showing that peacekeeping can be a really disruptive force. It creates new inequalities, and it creates new forms of insecurity, which is obviously quite contradictory. So I thought maybe could you tell us a little bit more empirically about what some of those dynamics are, because I think that's really interesting for understanding that kind of wave of protest against peacekeeping today.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I document in the previous book, some of that comes out, but then it's sort of different empirical examples that I share in this book around, the ways in which peacekeepers bring with them colonial attitudes, whether they're from the global south or not, because there is this tendency in the in the literature on sexual exploitation and abuse, there was a tendency to sort of target global south militaries as the perpetrators of abuse. And in fact, global south militaries, as I outline in the book, were constantly telling me how they were good soldiers and that they weren't involved. Even when I wasn't talking to them about sexual exploitation and abuse, which was the majority of the time, I was not interested in that particular topic. They would just tell me the whole time, we're not abusing any local people, we're not, and it was like, okay, but because they were going to be perceived as developmental armies or developmental militaries, they had to project an image of themselves that global north militaries never had to, with much smaller numbers of potential perpetrators, actually. Like 5 Canadian military officers in Haiti would have much higher level of visibility and discretionary power than at 100 Ghanaian soldiers that are more or less locked on base. So I think there was like lots of examples where peacekeepers would tell you, but in terms of creating new forms of inequality, I mean, I sort of outline in the Civilizing Mission chapter, in the Global Colorline chapter, like just some of the ways in which peacekeepers perpetuated these colonial ideas that were, either circulating or, there's like an intertextuality to those colonial narratives. So Balkan peacekeepers, for example, reiterated these colonial stereotypes about African women, in particular in Liberia, but also, they reiterated these ideas of these very racist ideas about, about dirt, disorder, disease that they had, in the way they described the peace kept as ungrateful or as, not have, I think about the example that I have in the book about, one of the close security peacekeepers who talked about how he went out to buy his own washing machine, because he didn't feel like he took his clothes, he had to wear suits as part of his duty, not actually military uniform, well, at least some of the time. And he would take his suits to the dry cleaners and he felt like they didn't do a very good job and they were sort of messing him around. And so he bought his own washing machine and got the washing machine installed into his because he could clean better than locals could clean. And so there was this whole thing about cleaning that, even though most military people are already, trained in taking care of themselves and so on. So there was ways in which they perpetuated these older stereotypes. And then, stuff around that I document in the book around like all these incidents that I witnessed around littering or, standing outside of a press, a weekly press a sort of civ-mil relations kind of meeting, and this guy standing outside having a cigarette break, and he just kind of unwraps his cigarette from the plastic and just sort of like throws the plastic into the sort of communal gardens outside of the civic center, you know, kind of thing. And I just kind of cast my eyes on it, and he was like, well, this is a shithole anyway, you know. Like, so those little, they seem very little, but they cumulatively added to this idea that not only was this sometimes a blank slate, like a tabula rasa, but it was also very much a place filled with a kind of imposed stigma, like that it was kind of, yeah, like a spell was cast in their eyes on this place that made it kind of doomed to saving, even though they were invested in that rescue narrative. They were also like disparaging about it. And then one really good example was a peacekeeper who set up these self-defense classes because he was trained he had a black belt in jiu-jitsu, and so he wanted to put on these self-defense classes to sort of like build confidence and, you know, build some sort of relationship with the community. And then so he held these self-defense classes, and he brought, you know, he went to the shops and brought biscuits and juice and stuff like that, so that there would be like, and then people came and they ate all the biscuits and the juice, and then they sort of like, each time they came like less of them came, and eventually there was just like 3, and they mainly came for the biscuits and the juice. And he somehow thought that that was like so morally corrupt that people were like using this opportunity to come and just, you know, mess around, according to him. And, you know, I thought, well, that's so interesting that, like, you know, he's come up with this sort of slightly entrepreneurial sort of idea of progress and self-care, but that it's based in this, like, colonial mentality of, you know, the sort of grateful or ungrateful native that, you know, so yeah, and he used very much his own experience of being on the receiving end of peacekeeping. So as a Balkan peacekeeper, he was like, we had peacekeepers in our country, and we had to be told what to do by, you know, African peacekeepers, for example, you know, which was, and now we're here and they're not listening to us, you know, kind of thing. So there was, you know, but again, this is not to like put individual blame. I'm thinking about how those narratives circulated both amongst the military peacekeepers, but as well as the civilian peacekeepers. Yeah, yeah.
I think, yeah, before opening it up, I want to return to what I think is also the related key point of the book, which is about thinking about peacekeeping not as a practice, not just looking at what's done and therefore how to improve what's done, but also, as you said, trying to think of it as an epistemic project. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that argument in terms of what is this knowledge, who produces it, and what are its implications? Why does this matter to reframe peacekeeping in this way?
Yeah, good question. That's why
Sorry, it's the big one.
No, that's why the conclusion's so short. I ran out of steam. I think because I'd said it, you know, like throughout the book over and over again, and it just seemed like, you know, I was hammering a point home that had already been achieved, I think, throughout the book. I guess to say it's an epistemic project means that I guess that we have to, that I'm asking and inviting people to stay in the world of imagining, you know, because I think there is there's a reaction in us to think about, like, but come on, you know, there must be something, like there must be some good that comes of it, like it can't be all bad, or there must be some element that we can save, you know, and keep, and so I guess what I wanted to reiterate by focusing on the epistemic nature of it was, let's just stay in what do we know about peacekeeping and how do we come to know it. And if we come to know it through these more critical literatures, then we won't perhaps be as attached to the idea of fixing it, because we don't see it as necessarily something that should exist in the first place. You know, and I think that happens in development studies. It's like, well, should you teach development studies by introducing students to the critical perspectives from the outset. But then then everybody is like steeped in this critical literature, and then they can't finish the rest of the course because they're like, what's the point, of analyzing this development project when it's racist and colonial and sexist and like at the heart is not participatory in any way. So, but then on the other hand, if you start from development as this benign, innocent project, then when you get to the critical literature, you're like, oh my God, I've been like duped for 9-10 weeks, So you've got to kind of read them, I guess you've got to read them both because you need to know what the existing knowledge is. So I don't advocate for not reading this mainstream, what I call mainstream problem-solving literature. I just think read it in a slightly lower dosage because I think it's overwhelmingly mystifying. When you read it en masse, it can, I think, distract you from what critical perspectives can lead you to do. And I think if I think about why we need to stay in the imagination, I think it leads to us being able to think about abolitionist perspectives, about ending peacekeeping for much longer. And it allows us to politicize these moral positions that we need to take so that we can actually say, well, this isn't purely ideological as if that in and of itself is a bad thing, but that like actually the only moral conclusion that we can reach is that it can't go on. Like, I always describe it as the wretch that cannot be saved, to use the salvational, civilizing language. It's like it can't be saved. So why not allow ourselves to think more, I don't know, more openly about what the knowledge that we have gained from these more critical perspectives, what kind of avenues it can send us down. I don't know what those are, but yeah, but I'm really hoping that others come up with some responses.
Well, it gives us a lot to think about.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I think at this point I'm going to open it up.
I'm going to do the questions because I also want you to be able to answer them.
Okay.
Yes.
And I think if you were taking questions, people won't see you as a potential person to answer.
Okay.
Right? Okay. And it also means you can think. Okay, so do we have any questions? Okay, so we have a lady in a lovely pink jumper and a gentleman here. So let's go to the lady first. Thank you, Preston.
Thank you so much. My question is honestly to both of you, because I'm curious, at the beginning you mentioned Paul Williams, and he is a big supporter of militarization. And his biggest argument, right, is that actually increasing, to use the word that you use, robustness of peacekeeping missions, which he says is, actually giving more specialized training, increasing the equipment that they have, can actually lessen violence. And especially, I think one of the biggest examples that he uses is that in cases where groups are being persecuted, especially in isolated areas, such as refugee camps in rural areas, that these violent conflicts can be avoided. So I was wondering if you found in your book and in both of your experiences that to be true at all, that ethnic minorities can be protected through peacekeeping missions and then if not, how do you kind of counteract that military point of view that he has?
Thank you very much. And the gentleman down here.
Yeah, my question is kind of related. There seems to be a sort of, in sort of the field itself, especially in Africa, I think the euphemism they now use is peace enforcement. And it's the shift away from...
Peace enforcement.
Peace enforcement,
yeah. The shift away from peacekeeping and actually saying, no, we want to be a lot more combative, a lot more aggressive, and I think there is a lot of pushback from even practitioners in the field who come from a sort of developmental peace building rather than peacekeeping thing. But I just thought, you sort of spoke about the death of peace building, and it is dying, and you spoke to this, but it does seem to be going in the wrong direction. And I thought, I wonder what you thought about that, and just sort of, yeah, it's sort of related.
Yeah. Can we take one more question? The lady right there in front.
Thank you very much. Yesterday, the UN peacekeeping mission in Lebanon said that Israeli forces deliberately fired on its position and injured 2 peacekeepers. So I was wondering, could you share maybe your insights on this? And can that shed light on other ways to think about the crisis of peacekeeping? I'm thinking about especially in international law.
Okay, we'll take those 3 and then we'll have more questions.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, sure.
Should we do one by one?
Sure.
Okay, first question. Increasing robustness, really great question. I'm not going to pretend that I have the answer here, but I'm going to share some thoughts from my conversations in recent fieldwork around this. So, does increasing robustness lessen violence? I think this would be a great interview question to kind of ask people, perhaps, you know, the peace kept, or people living, for instance, with the UN peacekeeping mission in DRC for 30 years. I'd say there are 2 things to say here. On the one hand, there is growing frustration in a kind of drawback in the level of investment in actually taking action. So in DRC, the mission has gone through several different stages of kind of withdrawal from active kind of combat. So it went to something called protection through presence, the idea that just because we're here, that will be enough to protect people. And then once the UN actually withdrew from a lot of rural areas, it became protection through projection, the idea that we're now projecting our presence, and that's enough to protect. So you can imagine there was a related amount of cynicism towards, okay, does this work? What's the point having people who are there to protect us if they're only in the kind of richer urban areas and they're not where a lot of the kind of violence is taking place? So there, on the one hand, I can imagine that I would have some conversations where people think back to this golden era of kind of investment and belief in international kind of liberal interventionism. And in particular in Eastern DRC, there was the Force Intervention Brigade in 2012-2013, which did use violence and did actually take part in hostilities. So sometimes that's kind of referred to as, if only there was that kind of robustness of the past, the end of peacekeeping is actually a bad thing. On the other hand, I think that that kind of argument is weakened by perhaps what you're saying here in the center, by the fact that there is a kind of contradictory trend of actually a lot of military power, and perhaps that military power and robustness is shown in the wrong ways at certain times. So again, just thinking back to Eastern DRC, 2022, there were, I think, around 22 protesters who were killed by peacekeeping forces during these kind of violent clashes. So that was seen as a kind of example of where there is robustness, but in the wrong places. And I think that takes us back to one of the questions that Marsha really has in her book, which is, which lives are prioritized here in the way that robustness is actually implemented in practice? Yeah, that would be my 2 cents.
Okay, you know, just on that, I'll just continue on from that robustness question, because that's really interesting, because I think if you think about that question and that positioning in the literature, like the question that kind of hypothesis that's put forward, that is very much about being epistemically located in a completely different place within the literature. But I do think it's, you know, I'm just thinking in regard to similar incidents to what Myfanwy has just talked about. There was also this incident in 2005 in Haiti, where there was crossfire between UN peacekeepers, Brazilian UN peacekeepers, if I recall correctly, and local militia gangs, however they're referred to. And I think 25 people were killed in this, and there was a big investigation tracing bullets and where they'd come from. But then Several UN weapons had been stolen from vehicles that had been left with windows open. So then the UN had this new policy that you couldn't drive around with your windows open because either snakes would be thrown in or weapons would be confiscated from them. So there was like this idea that like the UN couldn't possibly have discharged weapons except in self-defense, and that they're, you know, when there was a case of people being killed, it was like, well, if they were killed by a UN bullet, it was either, you know, or a UN weapon, it was either because that weapon was stolen or because they were defending themselves and they were, you know, and it was an unintended consequence, as the UN loves to talk about. But so, like, I think this whole idea of robustness, but I think that actually links to a couple of other, you know, related questions or elements of related questions, which is like, so that whole robustness debate is like now taking on a new form because the kinds of conflicts that arise require a completely different response. Whether we think peacekeeping is in any way an appropriate response, like, because if peacekeeping is built on this more traditional, like, keeping warring parties apart after a peace agreement has been signed, then clearly that's really, that robustness is actually just conventional military action, right? So I guess it's also about like considering what peacekeeping is becoming in practice, and then whether we want that to be called peacekeeping or whether we want to just, my option's easier, just end it. And then there's, or as some people say, well, it's already ended anyway, and this new thing is not really going to be called peacekeeping, it's going to be called stabilization or like some kind of military intervention, like as you might have seen in Mali or in, you know, or yeah. So, but I think also that the more robust those missions have become or attempted to become, you also see more people killed in those. So in DRC, you have historically the Uruguayan military who had been killed in a few members of the Uruguayan military, and I think Bangladesh military have been killed in DRC. Then subsequently, the mission was upgraded, and then French military peacekeepers entered and were allowed, which was like a Chapter 6 mandate, you know. So I think that there is already a long history of when robustness has been argued to be put forward. But like, you know, like just so, you know, I know Paul and we've debated on various panels and stuff like that. But I guess I find it kind of interesting that there isn't an account of that move from what would have been traditional peacekeeping kind of arguments, which were all about let's get peace agreements in place. There isn't an account of that shift by mainstream scholars. They're suggesting that this shift takes place because of the external nature of conflict. And I mean, it's kind of strange to talk about peacekeeping in an active conflict situation. Of course, but that's, you know, that's not the fault of Paul Williams, you know what I mean? Like, but it's also the fault of, you know, Haiti, for example, where there was never a war or peace agreement to be determined. And then just in relation to DRC, just to give you like again, I was talking about 15,000 peacekeepers arriving in Pristina. Well, think about the size of DRC, 9,000 peacekeepers, and the size of DRC, it's not like a massive landscape, it's like a massive geopolitical context. 9,000 is like a drop you know, of people. So such different, you know, sort of manifestations. So that's just to give you, in terms of like peace enforcement, which I think links with peace building. You know, Laura Shepard wrote a book a couple of years ago about peacekeeping, about peace building, and I thought that was really fascinating, some of the ways in which she was moving towards thinking about what would peace building, like what should peace building look like. And I think that there's the avenue for the end of peacekeeping to have some more utopian. But I think the people to inform that are the peace kept. And you know, all of the civil society organizations that play a role in building peace or in responding to peacekeeping, but who feature very little in that scholarship, right? So one of the books that I talk about is a book by Beatrice Pouligny, which is called Peacekeeping from Below, hardly ever cited. It's actually where, you know, she goes and talks with people, the peace kept, which she doesn't call the peace kept, and, you know, like, is asking them, like, what do you want? What do you think? And surprisingly, that's not very present in that whole peace building narrative that comes from the UN. And I can't leave this talk without actually addressing, I should have addressed it earlier, but you know, there was, in June, there was this tweet by someone, and I can't remember who the scholar is, talking about, you know, a very critical scholar who said, you know, we need peacekeepers in the context of, you know, what's happening in the occupation and the annihilation of Palestine. And I was thinking, oh gosh, no, I've just argued for the end of peacekeeping. Like, the last thing we need is peacekeepers in this space. And then yesterday and over the last few days, there's been a couple of reports also about, I don't know if anyone's seen the one about the Irish peacekeepers. And so, you know, just how long the Irish peacekeepers have been there, and then attacks on peacekeepers. Again, this goes back to that problematic narrative that somehow peacekeepers' lives, well, some peacekeepers' lives are somehow more important. Like, I don't, you know, if, frankly, I'm all for the instrumentalist approach. If the death of a few peacekeepers gets a global intervention to live stream genocide, I'm all for that being used instrumentally. But I don't think, like, I find it strange that people are suddenly turning to peacekeeping as a potential aftermath to this assault on Palestinians and Lebanese people. I can't imagine what a peacekeeping mission would look like. Like, it just seems to me that I'm even more politicized and radicalized in the end of peacekeeping by imagining that, because I think that that reinforces the idea of this two sides version of the conflict of equal sides, and it goes back to a kind of peacekeeping thinking that I don't think has a practical setting anymore. I don't know if that's really answered your question, but I definitely don't think peacekeepers should be. Yeah.
Okay, so let's open up for more questions. I see a question down here in the front row, and this gentleman here. Oh, let's go. Yeah, we'll come to the gentleman after the ladies first.
Hi, so you proposed the end of peacekeeping, and I was just wondering if another type of institution like a peace verification mission could be an alternative. So, for example, in Colombia, there's a verification mission instead of a peacekeeping, which is less military and kind of focusing on other aspects of peace building, but still poses some challenges. And some of the people working for the mission are also from military background. So it might kind of have some similar problems, but not the same as peacekeeping. So I was just wondering if you think this could be an alternative, or if it just poses the same challenges and is still part of the same epistemic project.
Thank you very much. And related now.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask what you think is, down here, what you think is the role of conflict resolution in the current system, and also
the role of?
Conflict resolution in the current system, but also in any new system that could arise. I really wanted to ask about this because I think some of the doom and gloom and protracted conflicts that we see are due to the lack of conflict resolution as a part of interventions. And also maybe this is a way for the peace kept to then become their own peacekeepers long term.
Thank you. And the gentleman.
Hi, great meeting you today. Just curious, within the context
Can
of
you
it,
maybe put the microphone more like horizontal?
Is that
Yes.
better?
Yeah.
Cool. Just within
Where
the
are you?
context
There
of
you are.
a country like Haiti, for example, which within the last 3 years has seen this whole political system pretty much collapse. And there has been like a limited, I guess, peacekeeping with like around 400 Kenyans, I believe, who are there right now. What do you think is the role of peacekeeping there? And if there shouldn't be any peacekeepers, then what do you think is the solution to that problem?
Where
Where was it? Sorry.
In Haiti?
In Haiti,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, we'll start with those three and open up.
Okay.
Shall I? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so in terms of the sort of alternative versions of peacekeeping, or I guess if I have to consider what I would salvage from things that I've seen. So one of the things that I talk about very briefly in the book, but has actually really influenced me, is that like I saw a lot of inequalities amongst both civilian and military peacekeepers more broadly. So when I first went in 2006, I noticed that peacekeepers had very altruistic individual beliefs about changing things. And this was early on in Liberia, for example, very proximate to the peace agreements and the conflict. And so, yeah, so people had very, both civilian and military officers, like rather than contingent staff, who I didn't have a lot of interaction with necessarily. But they imagined that their role in peacekeeping would have a significant impact on transforming the landscape, although all of it was very much based on a liberal peace agenda, you know, and the kinds of narratives about development and, you know, getting back on their feet and, you know, using their resources and building the economy and so on. Narratives that, for example, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, as the president of Liberia, used herself. But then when I went back in 2012 and 2013, the kind of peacekeepers that were present, both again civilian and mostly police, they had a very different narrative. They didn't see their presence as affecting that kind of change. In fact, they actually articulated how peacekeeping was really going to help their own families. And many of them were from context with various sort of employment and economic crises. So, you know, I'm just thinking of examples of Ukrainian peacekeepers who were from the military, but who were in charge of aviation and so on. And their salaries back home, you know, just as an example, would be something like $900 US. Working in the peacekeeping mission allowed them to have approximately $5,000 US, more or less tax-free. So for them, it was really about sending remittances back home and mobilizing their own families outside of the political and economic sort of crises that they felt they were in. So they didn't say anything in their narratives about wanting to affect change locally. And some of them were returnees. They'd been on several peacekeeping. So I'm not so sure about whether I have faith in the, because I think civilian peacekeepers are very much indoctrinated into the martial culture of the space, as well as are picked or volunteer from. I mean, in this case, civilian peacekeepers are selected more or police peacekeepers and civilian peacekeepers, as opposed to military peacekeepers who don't have as much choice in selecting. So yes, and I also think there's in the original group that were working as civilian peacekeepers, as human rights officers, as political affairs officers, they were, many of them had their master's degrees from LSE, from Essex in human rights. They actually were, well, the sample that I saw, this is not all UN missions, but they were from quite elite backgrounds, and that basically there was a parallel to the diplomatic service that they could be involved in. So I'm not so sure about whether inequalities that I outline in the book would be significantly challenged by the presence of this elite global civil servant class that is occupying one level of peacekeeping, and then this very very mixed class group of soldiers and security personnel. So I think that there's like a kind of divide between the martial and the civilian that I think creates and perpetuates some inequalities within and externally amongst the peace camp. So that's a very empirical answer to your question in a way, but yeah, I mean, in terms of the sort of negotiations that can be made, there's new work by Chiara Ruffa, who's at Sciences Po, who's looking at the sort of micropolitics of negotiations at sort of the dinner table, basically, or the shared lunch table amongst Israeli and Palestinian, for example, policymakers and civil servants and so on. And she's just looking at the kind of, at the ways in which peace or conflict is negotiated across these very everyday rituals of not quite breaking bread together, but of having these meetings. So yeah, I would say I would look to anthropological studies of development workers, of humanitarian workers. There's also work that you might want to look at by Hannah Wright, who did her PhD here at LSE, where she interviewed civil servants in Foreign Office here in the UK, fascinating about their ideas on coloniality, their ideas on gender, and how that led them to take particular stands on military action or not. So yeah, that's one way I would say that, yeah. Maybe you can go and I can come back.
Yeah, maybe I'll move on to the peace resolution, peace accords. And your question was just about kind of what role do they play in general?
Yes, and how
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it's very context specific, but I think the key questions are who gets what compromises are made, and what incentives does that create, if I could kind of boil it down. Obviously, peace accords, peace resolutions are crucial. I think, again, if I just take a kind of example from Eastern DRC, we also see that, unfortunately, they can also create kind of contradictory incentives, which over time can also help prolong a kind of no peace, no war kind of context. So scholars, in particular in political science, who work on Eastern DRC have really pointed out that even though official war ended in 2003, the kind of big peace accord, since then war has continued. And what scholars have done is really tracked the peace accords that followed and looked at the number of kind of self-identified armed groups and rebel groups and how that changed over time. And what they show is that there were lots of incentives to join an armed group, to create an armed group, inflate your numbers once the peace accords came around, because then you were going to get a seat at the table and you could also fight for your kind of part of the pie. So what they show is that it really depends how these peace accords are negotiated, kind of how sensitive they are to these kind of dynamics, who's leading them. But unfortunately, there are cases where absolutely this is why they need to be context specific, because otherwise they can have really contradictory effects in practice, and that's just kind of one example. But obviously they're key. It's just about what happens when there are accords and resolutions repeatedly, and what kind of incentive structures are those creating to explain why there hasn't been a real final resolution.
There was the final question about Haiti.
Yeah, I was just looking up Haiti in my index just to see if. So I think one way to return to that question that you had earlier about, how do we come to know peacekeeping? And I was thinking that, you could stretch that for so many things. Like, how do we come to know the DRC? How do we come to know, do we come to know Haiti through what we read from the peacekeeping literature? That would be a really dull and painful way to come to know Haiti. And I mean, maybe the question is arrogant in and of itself, can we ever know Haiti, without it being colonial, without it being with this sort of epistemic privilege, not epistemic privilege in the way that Patricia Hill Collins uses it, which is to think about those who are on the margins actually having a unique standpoint, but actually the epistemic privilege that comes with, having an amazing array of resources and books and collections and archives and so on. But yeah, I was thinking about like all the books that don't end up, being consulted when thinking about peacekeeping in Haiti. And I was thinking about a really excellent piece of work by Erica Capel-James, an anthropologist who's at MIT, wrote this amazing book interviewing people. And I believe that Erica worked as a rehabilitation physiotherapist assistant. And so she was literally physically mending people and hearing about their accounts of trauma. It was actually a way in which she could consider and write about Haiti that challenged this epistemic arrogance that comes from only talking about Haiti as a sort of as a place devoid of agency or devoid of resistance to those imperial legacies and those imperial forces. And I think actually when thinking about the contemporary period in peacekeeping, I mean, I would really like to see a book that looks at the kind of history of peacekeeping protests, both in DRC, in Haiti, there's a really long history of people protesting. I mean, one of the names that they gave to the mission, so one of the acronyms for the mission in Haiti is MINUSTA, but really most people in Haiti referred to it as Tourista because they felt like the peacekeepers spent a lot of time on the beach, behaving and acting like tourists in that space. And so I think it would be really interesting to look at a very detailed and historical account of the forms of resistance that people, for example, in Cyprus, there's been there was a long history of resistance to British military bases, which actually is linked to the peacekeeping presence as well. So peacekeeping missions establish these huge antenna in these small spaces very close to residential areas so that they could, not just for the peacekeeping mission, but obviously Cyprus is now this, and has always been this key strategic location for what's happening in the Middle East, but, without consequences for the kinds of health impacts. Similarly, in Haiti, the cholera epidemic and also the civil suit that was successfully launched by a translator in Bosnia whose family, I don't know if anyone has seen the film, Ko Vadis Aida. It's a really excellent film about safe zones and peacekeeping in Bosnia. So I think I love a history of the kinds of ways in which people have countered the power of the UN and some of the ways in which that has enabled a kind of different story of peacekeeping to be, a different knowledge of peacekeeping to be told. I don't think that answers your question at all, but.
If I could really quickly add to the Haiti question. In terms of how that's going to go, who was it that asked the question? In terms of how that's going to go, we'll see. I would really recommend the book There Is No More Haiti by Greg Beckett. It's kind of an anthropological text based on kind of 20 years of engagement with the country, and he basically tries to think about how the problem of Haiti is framed and how it's almost a place, a kind of laboratory where everybody has a go of fixing. And he kind of challenges that and says, well, what if we look at the really long history of Haiti? as a kind of slave state that emerged, the contribution to the kind of rights of man, some of the kind of key Enlightenment ideas. And if we really want to understand crisis in Haiti, then we need to attend to that much longer history and think about kind of complicity, in particular of key Western states. So I think that might be one interesting book for thinking about this very recent kind of next chapter in what is already a long history of having a go at fixing Haiti.
Okay. Sorry, can I just add one thing? It's just it's not about my book, but I just, in case you are now hooked on peacekeeping, I doubt that would happen. If you're interested, there's another talk on peacekeeping on Wednesday, the 30th of October here at LSE, hosted by the Department of Gender Studies and Department of International Relations. It's called Fixing Gender, the Paradoxical Politics of Training Peacekeepers. And it's recent book that's just out, I think just a few days ago, or maybe a few weeks ago, by Aiko Holvikivi. And it's really about, it's not so much about peacekeeping, so maybe you've had your fill. It's mostly about, you know, how gender features in peacekeeping and the ways in which people try and fix it, both in the problem-solving sense, but also fix it, keep it in place, keep it in its binary form. Yeah, really fascinating. So that's Wolfson Theatre, 5:30 to 7 p.m., 30th of October.
Okay, we do still have some time for extra questions. There is a question at the back, very back there, and a question on this side. And I'm going to take four, I see 4 hands up, and I'm prioritizing people who didn't ask a question last week. And I think we'll take those 4. So let's start with the gentleman at the back.
Hello, thank you very much. Do you think that the problem that we have is that we expect more...
Could you put the microphone like this?
Like this?
Yeah.
Do you hear me now?
A little louder.
Do you think that the problem that we have is that we expect way more than what we should from the UN to begin with? And
that could have been much shorter.
yeah, in the sense, like at the end, the intent of peacekeeping operation is to maybe promote a buffer zone and deliver some relief, right? You bring in water and food, and that's already something. And for example, for the Sierra Leoneans, it has worked, right? It was a fantastic peace agreement that was going on there, and it's working. They even made songs about it, thanking the US and the UN and all of it. So I see some utility in that, and I believe we should leave it there, but not really debunk the whole idea of peacekeeping, and rather leave it to the neighboring states, the regional blocs around the countries, to really tackle those roots of the issue ongoing and keep and strengthen and make the peacekeeping operations more robust in order to be more efficient in relief assistance, right? I don't know what's your views on that.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman up here, and the lady in the orange there.
Okay. Hello. Okay, it's very fascinating you talk about the concept, the notion of epistemic.
Sorry, there's just a fan behind us here, so could you just speak up just a tiny bit?
So it's for me, it's very fascinating. You talk about the notion of epistemic, and this can be a form of violence. And you know, it's very fascinating, very interesting that this form of violence sometimes perpetuated by the agency like UN. You know, I'm very interested in your new epistemic project that you draw from post-colonial scholarship and Black feminist scholarship. Can you point out, you know, particular insights that you get from this scholarship? Okay.
Thank you very much. And the lady in the orange.
Hello. Okay. Thank you for this interesting conversation. So I was actually taking a course in peacekeeping before coming to LSE, but at that time I wasn't really exposed to these critical approaches. So I was more exposed to the literature that argue for the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping in terms of mitigating civilian deaths. And I remember a study talking about, you know, different types of UN peacekeeping have different effectiveness. When there's like presence of military troops and UN police, it's better than just UN observers because it shows a stronger signal from UN to maintain peace. I'm wondering, like, what's your perspective on this whole body of literature that argues for the effectiveness, of UN peacekeeping, especially mitigating civilian deaths?
Okay, and if you could just pass the microphone to the lady in the red jumper. Yeah. I'd have to do a little bit of yoga.
Is that you?
Did you not have a question? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Red jumper.
Put you on the spot there to ask a question.
There's always one where just randomly we choose somebody to ask a question. No.
Okay, thank you so much for the interesting discussion. I thought it was quite interesting how you mentioned that we have to kind of stay in the world of imagining and to understand or to know it via the literature, because actually today in class, in this class called Managing Humanitarianism, we just learned about Craig Cohern's concept of emergency imaginary and how it does harm. Because this kind of stereotype of what an emergency is amplified through the media, which is also underlined through geopolitical interests. And I do understand that when you say imaginary, you mean something totally else. But I think, just using the same words, I think it's important to be quite clear about, by saying imaginary, what do you mean? And kind of how should this process of imagination that you propose be unfold in order to kind of avoid the harm of imagination that we're already seeing in this kind of current world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, can I start?
You could start.
Yeah, well, because I just want to start on that last point, because I think that's such a good thing, because that's such a good question and such a good comment, because I guess what I don't want to do is further mythologize the imagination as somehow an apolitical space. So I think that's really great that you brought that up. I guess it's about so I see the trajectory that I take in the book and that I want other people to go on with me as these exposing the roots of these different interventions in the field, not the actual. And so I struggled throughout the book actually reconciling, at times I'm talking about the peacekeeping scholarship, at times I'm talking about peacekeeping that I observed, like peacekeeping practice, and then sometimes I'm talking about peacekeeping as an organization or the UN as an institution. So I mix a lot of those together. And I do so not out of laziness, but out of genuine, I haven't weeded those out, and I don't want to do any more on peacekeeping, so I'm going to leave that a little bit messy. But I guess what I wanted to say about the imagination was just that, so at the end of Razik's book, as I pointed to, she sort of says, well, she's posed, so 2004 is when her book came out, literally 20 years back, and she was posed the question by quite a few people, well, what do you suggest as an alternative? And she's like, look, it's, we can't even get to the point where we're exploring an alternative because we haven't accepted some of these, we haven't dwelled in this exposés, these, we haven't unpacked power relations, and we haven't unpacked what she calls race pleasure, or as Agatha Angelou and Ling talk about as the desire industry. So she says we haven't dwelled in that knowledge yet. So I guess I'm thinking about knowledge and the imaginary in this really active, politically accountable way. But thank you for that, because that's really important. Maybe I'll say something about effectiveness and Black feminist thought, okay. And then, sorry, about effectiveness. I'm really, I both disavow that literature and partly engage with it because you can't escape it. So I feel caught in a kind of peacekeeping trap. I think the thing about the effectiveness is that it goes back to that point that I said, from whose perspective are we judging this effectiveness and what are the indicators of that effectiveness. And most of the time that effectiveness is very much based on the same kinds of effectiveness indicators that the military uses, right? Like, so there's always these questions like, well, if we add women to the military, you know, how this will improve effectiveness. Like, how? I don't even understand that, because most effectiveness indicators in the military are based on logistics, on resources, on very, you know, very tangible. It's not based on the sort of identity of an individual. So, you know, and then recently some study actually talked about effectiveness in organizations that I was looking at, and it said actually the more neurodiverse your group of employees, the greater the effectiveness is of that organization for reaching particular goals. So maybe that's like the future of peacekeeping, is thinking about incorporating and being more inclusive about its very able-bodiedness at the center. But yeah, so the effectiveness it's quite difficult to get my head around that. I think I'm going to be constantly in a kind of dialogue. But, you know, just going back to that question about Paul Williams, and but that is one thing. So I guess what I would say about effectiveness is, why isn't any of the literature on effectiveness, why does none of it grapple with trying to figure out what the impact of peacekeeping is in terms of furthering geopolitical or racial or ethnic inequalities? Like, why does it not try and measure other forms of harm in relation to effectiveness? So it could, for example, embrace the colonial critique, you know, the critique of it engendering other kinds of inequalities or furthering or exacerbating. But it doesn't. It only tries to measure, for the most part, the effectiveness of the institution to meet these already predetermined goals. So that's my problem with effectiveness. And in terms of Black feminist insights, you know, as I mentioned, the Say Her Name campaign really influenced me, but also just thinking about all the work that like Cynthia Coburn and Dubravka Zarkov did. So I didn't mention this, but when I was, so that early 2000s work, in 2003, I think, Cynthia Coburn and Dubravka Zarkov had this edited collection on military masculinities and peacekeeping. And it's one of the few articles that I've ever read, or a few chapters. And in that chapter, they actually interview women who, as they articulate in the chapter, provided sexual services for peacekeepers in Bosnia. And they actually interviewed some of these women and asked them, what do you want? You know, what would you think would improve? What would be the benefit? And they actually said like two things: to be free from violence and to have the money that has, you know, the sum that has been agreed upon to be paid and not to be, you know, negotiated after the fact. And I thought, wow, and again, this piece of work has rarely been cited in any of the work on sexual exploitation and abuse since. So I guess I'm particularly interested in how these insights from feminists, let alone the insights that we get from, so Coburn and Zarkov use the idea of standpoint theory, and they draw on it from both Dorothy Smith, but as well as Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, and so on, to sort of say, well, actually from where these women are standing, this is the perspective on peacekeeping. And so that's partly what I try and say is like, okay, if we listen to some of these critical scholars and position ourselves to ask these questions in peacekeeping from a different place, not so much what makes it effective, but, you know, what is the perspective of this individual being, you know, being given these various things from the UN. Yeah, so that's not so specific, but, you know, standpoint theory is one that really led me to question that. Yeah.
If I really quickly just pick up on the effectiveness question. I empathize with what you're saying. Like, there is a big part of me that's like, yeah, there is definitely a role, and what if it could just do its role better, right? And I think it's actually really linked to your comment about the emergency imaginary, in that there are these cases where I think we can say that there was a success if we go by the kind of metrics that the mission had itself. So Sierra Leone is a good example. I suppose there's also a really key temporal aspect here. So that would be a success, but again, I mean, just to go back to Eastern DRC, because it is where I work, what happens when that safe space zone wasn't created? When is the moment where people say, this is not working, so we need to do something different? I think that would be an interesting question. So the idea of coming in, creating a kind of stalemate of some kind of safe zone so that things can move forward. I wonder how people working in the peacekeeping mission in DRC would respond to that sort of 30 years later, in that what happens also when that, just the work that's an attempt to do that, becomes a system with all of these kind of contradictory incentives and dynamics, which means that actually the conflict continues. So I think when I have conversations in particular with activists in DRC asking MONUSCO, the peacekeeping mission, to leave, I ask this question about, did you believe that it would work at the beginning? And they still hold on to this hope that it would be effective. And actually what I find really interesting is that they can't, and I understand why, there's this inability to really understand why it has been so ineffective. And so the broad belief in Eastern DRC is that the UN peacekeeping mission is being ineffective on purpose, so that they can continue to have their job. They continue to gain money by being there as peacekeepers. And that actually is a really interesting commentary on the complete disbelief at how ineffective that idea was. That this is what we thought would happen, it didn't, and we now can't make sense of why we're still in this position 30 years later. So I agree, there is something there about, that's a nice kind of idea, and we've seen it play out like that in some contexts, but I think in others, we're so far from that then there are different questions about where do we go from here, if that makes sense.
Okay, I think we're going to close here. I'd like to thank Marsha so much for coming back and talking with us. I'd also like to thank Myfanwy, and I'd also like to thank all of you guys for your great questions. I know that James wanted to ask a question, but you guys were too engaged, so we didn't get to it. But we can find out in the White Horse pub what his question was. So please join us if you have the time in the White Horse pub. Next week we also have another talk from Mann, who's going to be talking about re-examining the history of the Industrial Revolution, all going to be about the contingency of things coming together at the same time. So see you next week and have a good weekend. Until then.